Good morning. Welcome to the Unveiled Treasures, the Lost EC Comics interviews. I'm Alex Grand. I'm founder of the Comic Book Historian's Social Media and author of Understanding Superhero Comic Books, which now has the audiobook out. And I'm moderating today's panel with our esteemed guests. We have David Armstrong, former Senior VP of MGM and Golden Age comic historian to my right here, who's responsible for this footage that we're seeing today. And we have to our left here Grant Geissman, Grammy-nominated musician, EC Comics historian. Give him a hand. And to the far left here is Bill Field, my comic book historian's co-host, founder of Field of Comics, and fellow writer on Neil Adams' Master Illustrator. Give Bill a hand. And so before we start showing some of this awesome footage, we have, it all centers around the EC Comics Year 2000 reunion that had a good chunk of the bullpen. And it's really special footage. I had the pleasure of remastering it and kind of help editing a lot of this stuff with David's guidance, of course, as far as kind of what to focus on. David, why don't you kind of talk us through that dinner? And also Grant was at the dinner with a musical number with Russ Cochran, so both of them will kind of tell us about their experience at this dinner. So let's start with Dave.
So what you're looking at now is the final end of the dinner where everyone, and there's no sound here, so you're not missing anything. But these are all the people that were gathered, and you can see this is Al Feldstein talking to Ric Estrada, and that's Annie Gaines and Jack Davis. So all of these people got together for a dinner that was sponsored by the American Association of Comic Book Collectors in 2000. It was coincided with the EC reunion, and Russ Cochran was the moderator there and gave out awards. So when we get to that portion of the show, there's Russ. So when we get to that portion of the show, you'll hear him give introductions for each of the interviewees, and then the interview that we shot, which was shot against a green screen. There's Kaluta, and that's Jack Kamen. So you'll hear from each one of them one little story about their days at EC or how they interacted with other people there. And at this dinner, there was two things that. Well, one of the things is we had a crypt keeper there, and you'll see it in the background, but the crypt keeper was given to us, or loaned to us by Richard Donner. When Tales of the Crypt was made, each of the executive producers were given one of the latex rubber dummies of the crypt keeper. There were two animatronic ones that actually moved that they used for shooting, and then everyone else got copies. And that's what we borrowed from him for this show. And you'll see artwork in the background. All that came from Roger Hill. A phenomenal collection of artwork. And at the end of this little clip, you'll see some of that artwork along with... yes, he's as goofy as he looks.
And that's Bill Stout right behind Bill Elder there.
And then these are all things that were brought to exhibit by Grant Geissman. So talk about this.
Well, this event, first of all, it was a once-in-a-lifetime, quite literally, event. It happened right next door here at the Hyatt, in one of the big ballrooms. And like he said, virtually every EC, surviving artist was there, except for Johnny Craig and John Severin. And there was a tremendous display of EC original art, like all around the banquet walls, like you can imagine, like this whole thing lined up on the wall with EC art. And it was just a tremendous thing, which it also coincided with the release that year of my book, Tales of Terror, the EC Companion, which lists the entire contents of every EC and pictures the covers. And we had done a limited edition, and all these people agreed to sign tipping sheets for the book, and so at this event they were all given their contributor copies of that book, and it was just a stunning event.
So the first clip I want you to take a look at is Russ Cochran talking about his relationship with Bill Gaines and how it got established, and the importance is the fact that Russ Cochran probably brought back EC to a brand new audience in the 70s and 80s, and Grant can talk about the importance of that.
Well, I mean, really, single-handedly, Russ Cochran is the guy that kept EC alive and kept the torch burning, you know, through all of his various EC reprint projects. Probably the most important of which was the complete EC library, you know, complete EC titles in box sets, which were so, you know, and I think the first one came out in '78, and at the time people said, oh, I mean, it's great, but there's no way he's going to be able to complete this thing. And he did it. It took him like 30 plus years to do it, but, you know, he finally reprinted, you know, pretty much every EC comic except for the, you know, the ones from the 40s that no one wants to look at anyway.
And he included the pictofiction stuff, too.
Yeah, he did pictofiction. So anyway, you know, Russ Cochran was extremely important.
Many of you know how I got into this whole thing. I was a physics professor, head of the physics department at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, and I got to go on one trip a year for educational purposes, all expenses paid trip, naturally. And I always went to New York and skipped the physics meetings and went to see Bill Gaines and hung out with him and watched old movies with him and talked about the EC days and went out to dinner with him. And we became very good friends, and he was sort of a father figure to me, and I miss him very much. And all of this wonderful EC tradition is because of Bill Gaines and his love for comics and his love for horror and science fiction and his magnificent sense of humor. So thanks again to Bill.
So the first clip that we're going to see is Russ Cochran introducing Jack Davis, and then it goes into the interview footage that we shot with a story about his work there.
The first one goes to a fellow from down in Georgia that we think of as the premier delineator of the Crypt Keeper, the artist who brought life to the Civil War books, and just an all-around good guy, very successful in every phase of art that he ever tried, Jack Davis.
There would be a written script, and I'd sit down with Al Feldstein and read it, and we'd go over it. But now Harvey would practically draw his stories on tracing paper, and he'd sit down with you and read it to you and almost act it out. So you'd go home, and he was really a perfectionist with what he wanted done. And Al was a little more lenient, you know, and I'd just take it home and do it and come back, and it was pretty horrible stuff. I mean, it got to be gruesome.
That's great. Something to notice is that caricature of Dave Armstrong. Jack Davis actually drew that, which is pretty cool. Grant, tell us about your relationship with Jack Davis and how it was getting to know him.
Well, he was the consummate Southern gentleman, and he helped me on some projects. You know, I interviewed him for my Feldstein book, but more importantly, he signed a lot of tip-in sheets for my various book projects, and he was always very happy to do it. You know, Nick Meglin, the editor at Mad, kind of, you know, said it would be okay to do that. You know, Grant's a good guy, whatever he told him, I don't know. But anyway, Jack was great with stuff like that, and just he was a sweetheart of a guy.
So you saw the little caricature he did of me. We were supposed to go to dinner one night, and there was a mix-up, and so he came to breakfast the next morning, and he brought his camera, and he took a picture of me and my wife, and 2 weeks later, that illustration showed up in my mail. He never said he was going to do it or anything. It just showed up, so, you know, I've got it framed on my wall.
You know, he was amazing in so many ways, but he was a little conservative, I would say. And the funny thing is he burned his own comics when the comics burning came up, and because he said that stuff was horrible, and it's just kind of funny to me. He was so good at what he did, yet he always kind of leaned to a little bit more comical, and so he was extremely important to Mad, wouldn't you say, Grant?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And that's where he started to shine. And then he was,
Well, he already shined, you know, right. As you were alluding to, he didn't love doing the horror. He thought it got pretty gory, which in fact it did. But, you know, it was embarrassing for all those guys when the, you know, Worthing stuff started coming out. And, you know, they were just making a living, and really none of them thought it was all that bad. It was just, you know, harmless stuff, you know. But it just became so, you know.
he was the highest paid commercial artist at one time.
He became.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
he's probably the most published cartoonist, I would say, in history.
Yeah.
It would be literally impossible to, you know, assemble a complete collection of all the ads and movie posters and records
Right.
and comics and bubblegum cards
Yeah.
and whatever else.
He went way beyond comic books.
Yeah, yeah.
So the next recipient in this award ceremony was Al Feldstein.
The next award goes to a man who I've thought of as the real driving force and the brains of EC. I said once, and I was quoted on this, and I liked it that I had said it, that Bill Gaines was the heart of EC. And the next man that I'm going to ask to come up, Al Feldstein, was really the brains and the man who was the driving force behind all the new trend comics. And I just really hope that I look this good when I'm in my 90s. No, I don't mean you're in your 90s. I just said I hope I look that good when I'm in my 90s. Al Feldstein.
We got very friendly, Bill and I. We became fast friends. He lived in Brooklyn and I lived in Brooklyn. Sometimes he would drive me home. We'd go to roller derbies together. We used to go to the Brooklyn Dodger games together. And I kept saying, you know, the problem with this industry is that the innovators survive and the imitators fall by the wayside when the trend dies, when it's overloaded, when it's overrun. Why don't we be innovators instead of imitators? Why don't we start our own genres? And that's how we got into talking about what we liked as kids and what we thought would sell. And I had remembered when I was a kid coming down, sneaking down the stairs to listen to The Witch's Tale, because my brother was listening to it with his friends 12 o'clock at night while he was babysitting for me. And The Witch's Tale, and Lights Out, and Inner Sanctum, and Frankenstein the movie, and Dracula, and gee, you know, let's put horror into comics. Now it wasn't the first time. There was Adventures into the Unknown, but it was kind of wimpy. And what I wanted to do was, you know, really scare the pants off these kids. And so he said, well, why don't we try it? So the Crypt of Terror, which I first created and wrote with a host, because that was impressed by the old witch who used to cackle and have a cat. And so she was 100 and some odd years old, and she was going to tell the story. So I had the Crypt Keeper tell the story, and the Crypt of Terror, and then that was tried out in his crime book, Crime Patrol. And then we tried out the Vault of Horror, which I also drew, in War Against Crime. And in those days, distributors had roadmen that would go around and check the newsstand, and if they got 20 issues of something on July the 3rd and 7 of them were sold by July the 20th, they were going to have a 70% sale of the total print order or whatever. They had to figure it out. And suddenly, War Against Crime and Crime Patrol showed good checkups. And Bill said, you know, Bill was no dope. I mean, it was that thing that we had introduced, that new trend, a new trend in comics, the Crypt of Terror, which we changed fortuitously to Tales from the Crypt, and the Vault of Horror. And then later on we did The Witch's Cauldron, who got her own book, Haunt of Fear, and that was the beginning of our horror comics.
I just want to say that picture of Al and a very much younger me with that painting, I commissioned that painting for the cover of my Tales of Terror book, and we had it on display, you know, at the EC dinner. So that's great. Yeah,
That's amazing. You know, I want to ask you, Grant, what was Al part, or was he the instigator of the shifting titles and genres in EC? How they
Bill and Al both were. You mean? Like, for example, what?
Well, like how Moon Girl became.
Oh, no. Al was not really even, well, at the very end of Moon Girl, Al was there. But, no, Al didn't.
No, but how titles would change into other titles.
The only one related to Moon Girl is they were going to drop Moon Girl, and they decided to turn it into a romance comic.
Moon Girl.
And they changed it to a girl romance.
Right.
Because it would save money with the Postal Service mailing permit. But what about if they could, convince the post office that it was a continuation of Moon Girl, and the post office is like, I don't think so. So they had to
And
pay
Jack
the
Kamen
deposit.
talks about that a little bit too.
But what about the transition from like the crime comics to horror?
Oh, definitely. That was Bill and Al, what he just talked about.
Yeah.
Feldstein said to Gaines, why are we chasing all the other companies? Why don't we do our own thing? What is it we like? And they talked about the old radio shows that they both used to listen to as kids, and that's what started the horror comics.
Absolutely amazing.
And then...
So it was like their friendship and mutual interest that.
Yeah, and they were buddies, because Gaines used to pick Al up every day. Feldstein lived in Brooklyn, and Gaines would swing by and drive the two of them to the office, and they would both chat about stuff. And Feldstein, he had the boss's ear, so it'd be like, hey, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And Gaines was, more than amenable. He wanted to get in there too and do something that he could own,
I probably known this next gentleman less than any of the other EC artists, not because I wanted it that way, but just because that's the way things seem to turn out. But this fellow, when you think of him, you think of crazy, zany. You think of his work with Harvey Kurtzman, and you think of his inking work with John Severin's pencils in the war books, in the science fiction books. And I especially think that he did some of his very best work with the parodies that he did for Mad and for Panic. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Elder.
See, comics I thought were the easy way to break into the business. It's a comic, and it has light literature. In fact, I always considered comic books the junk food of literature. And we were many years later, when we did Goodman Beaver, which I thought was an intelligent approach to art and social satire, was the food for thought, not the conscious, the dirty food or the fast food of literature, which it might well be. So it started me rolling, and it gave me standards to look forward to. And Harvey's idea of creating this book and finding the right people to do their work. In other words, he picked those artists he thought were properly geared for certain techniques and would best fill that story. Same with myself. He thought I would be good on practical jokes, doing the opposite, doing things that are completely absurd. And the young minds love that stuff. It's a complete breakaway from authority and parenthood. I mean, they always rejected their parents. This here was in two-dimensional form, in a comic book form.
So, Dave, tell us about your experience with Will Elder and talking to him and your impression of him.
Well, I was actually really surprised at how serious Will was about talking about the comic book business in general, because he's, other than the fact that he was an inker for Severin on a lot of the war books, he's basically a Mad and Panic artist and did all of these great satires. But he was very thoughtful about what he thought about the comic book business, and that kind of surprised me. Also, the other thing is, it shows that Harvey Kurtzman, when he came in to do both the war books and the satire books, that he brought his own group of people that he worked with, and he kind of set them up to do the things that they were best at. Severin did the war books, and Davis got a chance to do the war books, which I think he obviously loved far more than the horror books. So it's interesting to listen to him talk about it, because it's like putting him in front of a camera was one thing. If you watched it, the beginning piece, when the silent stuff that we looked at, he loved goofing for the camera. I mean, he was just he he did physically what he did in his comic book pages, which I found fascinating. And he was, well, who was the guy that he went to school with?
Well, he went with Al Jaffe.
Al Jaffe, yeah.
And Feldstein was also there at the same time.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that picture of the two of them, Jaffe and him at lunch? And they're messing around with their milk bottles and they're doing all this stuff.
They're making weird faces, exactly.
It was very evident that they had this relationship that was endearing for, well, decades.
Anyway, so let's take a look at Jack Kamen.
Jack Kamen did a story for EC, and his son, Bart, who was a little toddler at the time, or a little boy at the time, sort of messed it up. You know, he did his own artwork, added his own artwork to Jack's story before it was turned in. And I couldn't help thinking that if I had done something like that to something that my dad had been working on, he wouldn't have reacted the same way. But Jack actually cleaned it up a little bit and then put by Jack and Bart Kamen on the story. We always wondered, well, who's this Bart Kamen? Ladies and gentlemen, Jack Kamen.
Well, Al Feldstein, who you know, was an inker at Iger's shop, and he inked a lot of my things. Then he left before I did, and somehow or other he linked up with Bill Gaines, and that's when the romance comics era started. And one day he called me and he says, we're going to do romance comic books. And I told him, I said, I got a guy that can really do pretty girls. He says, which is your bag, you know, come and see us, you know. And at that time I was getting kind of itchy because I was getting different calls from different people. From, who was Bev Souza with that time? Oh, you would know, they do Casper the Friendly. Harvey. Right. I did some romance for Harvey, and this is when I left because I was just expanding. I was getting different higher page rate offers from these different people. So Al got me over to Gaines, and I started to do the romance over there. Now you know what happened. The romance phase passed, and they went into horror and crime. And it was during that time we developed a very friendly relationship. I mean, Al was always my very close friend. I got to be a close friend of Bill Gaines, and then he told me, you know, his proposition to me was, look, he says, I'll take care of you regularly. He said, he said, I want you available all the time, because I was fast, and I could really do whatever he wanted. And so I became exclusively Gaines' property. I wouldn't say property, but I stayed exclusively with Bill.
You know, it's funny. He was such a great artist and endearing, and he even went to the next generation when he did all the artwork, or a lot of promotional artwork, including the poster for Creepshow, and he just kept going, didn't he, Grant?
Not in comics, but he did a lot of advertising artwork.
Right.
Which paid way better than comics ever did. So he was kind of happy to wave goodbye to
Right. Well, and didn't he invest in his own son's company, Neil? And Neil, of course, went on.
Dean Kamen is an inventor, and
that's right.
He has hundreds of medical patents, including a small portable thing for a pump for insulin pump for diabetes is one of his patents. He also invented the Segway, that little scooter thing. So. He both helped his son Dean by drawing, you know, the patent applications of the inventions, and he also invested in Dean's company, meaning that Kamen was very financially well set at the end of his life. Yeah.
So the funny thing is, I said to Jack, I said, I asked other people, other artists, did you meet a lot of the other artists that worked at EC at the time? And he goes, no. I go, well, why not? He goes, well, I was friends with Al. And he goes, yeah. He goes, well, Al used to bring my assignment home. We lived next door to each other. He said, I never went into the office.
One stop away on the Long Island Railroad, I think, is what it was.
Right.
Yeah.
The one thing I want to add is something about the audio-visual format of looking at these interviews. You get a sense of their body language. and despite the great wealth, Jack seemed so grounded and down to earth.
Yeah,
And you can get that body
all,
language.
all
from
the
watching
EC people were super nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
Given
got
to a man and woman, including Marie Severin. Yeah.
Jack Kamen and I, he had a really good sense of humor. He had a great laugh. And I interviewed him, and then the next day we went to a panel, and I walked in, I was sitting next to Jack. It was Al Williamson, Angelo Torres. It was the science fiction guys. And Feldstein was not sitting up there. He was sitting 2 seats down. So Jack and I start talking, and Al leans over and goes, "Shh, they're talking." And Jack just goes, "So?"
This next artist probably did less work for EC than most of the others. In fact, his only complete story that he did was killed by the Comics Code and was never published. Back in the 50s, it was eventually published in the reprints that I did. He also worked with Al Williamson and Frank Frazetta and others of the infamous Flegel gang. Angelo Torres.
When I started art school, visual arts after the Army, the hottest thing going were the EC comics. So there was Williamson science fiction stuff, and I just loved his work. And I think I started drawing, as I developed in class, my style. I never really had a style. I can draw like anybody. I mean, I can imitate Disney. I've done several animated things for Mad Magazine. We did a takeoff on the Tarzan movie, and I just drew it like the way the Disney people did. The same thing with the Beauty and the Beast. I did a takeoff on that. I had a ball doing because I love animation anyway. But my style just went that way. I discovered Hal Foster more than I did before. I used to read Prince Valiant, but I never thought I would even attempt to draw like that. But I realized how attainable it was if you really worked at it. You would never be another Hal Foster, but the work was beautifully done and actually very simple when you really get down to it. So Foster and Raymond and Williamson, and of course Frazetta, which was a big influence too. That's the way I went with my work. And of course my teacher was Bern Hogarth, who had done Tarzan for so many years. So it was the whole thing just began to come together for me.
Yeah, David, tell us about talking with Angelo about the EC stuff.
So it was interesting. I ended up talking to Angelo about the EC stuff. I didn't really follow his stuff when he got to Mad, but he basically took over for Mort Drucker for doing the satire pieces. But he also
didn't take over from him. Mad wanted to do a movie parody and a TV parody in each issue, which was too much for Mort to handle. So they brought Ange on to kind of split up the duties a bit.
Yeah.
And they kind of asked him to do kind of in the Drucker style, which Angelo was able to do. But how old is Ange now? 91 or 92, is it? 92. And he still draws as good as he ever did. It's really stunning. It's incredible. Most artists, I hate to say, when they get a little older, their line gets a bit shaky and stuff like that. Angelo Torres has absolutely none of that, so it's really amazing.
And he's still very vibrant. I mean, in terms of his conversations. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, he came to Comic-Con about 10, 12 years ago with his nephew, and walked him around. It's like, and he was in his mid-80s at the time. So he's great.
One of everyone's favorite science fiction artists, the youngest of the EC artists at the time, which probably means he's still the youngest of the EC artists. We loved his work. We still do. He has been a big influence on lots of the artists drawing today, as he was influenced by the main comic artists of the 30s and 40s, such as Alex Raymond and Hal Foster and some of the other greats. Al Williamson.
I never know what to say to these things. Oh, gosh. Thank you. It was great working at the city, and I want to thank Roy Krinkle, Frank Frazetta, and Angelo Torres for making me look so good. They were great. We had a lot of fun working together. I was always late on my work. I never made it late, but I always waited a week. So I'd call my buddies and said, listen guys, I got to get this thing done. Can you come over and give me a hand? You know? So they would. And it was great. They were great guys to work with. Bill was a terrific guy. He, after a while, you know, he just threw up his hands and said, oh God, I don't care, just get the job in, you know. And it was very, very nice. I think Al Feldstein was very, very good. When he gave you the pages that were lettered already, he had written the stories and he had it lettered first. And he was very patient. He would go through the whole story with the artist, and he was just a terrific editor to work with. I think he was one of the finest editors I ever worked with. I give him a hard time, you know, you got to give him a hard time. But he really was a sweetheart, and he was a terrific editor, and I missed that when I worked with other companies. And I know I'm keeping you guys, so I'll let you go, and thank you very, very much.
So Al's the only one out of this crew that we didn't get to sit down in front of the camera on a green screen to get an interview. We had a scheduling mix-up, so we wanted to include his acceptance speech there. But I'll tell you, I met Al Williamson when he was working on Flash Gordon for King Features in the 60s, and I was always amazed at how talented this guy was. He was always cognizant of the fact that he worked slowly, and he was close to deadline, which is what he's talking about in this piece here. But he did some amazing things, and later in his career, he became an inker for other people, which kind of surprised me. Did you have any interactions with Al at all?
Only that he signed tip-in sheets for me and stuff like that. But
You know, it's kind of funny, but I knew Al relatively well, and I met him when I was very young, going to art school still at Dallas Fantasy Fair, and then we kind of kept up our friendship, and he was very helpful to me, and he was just one of the nicest guys in the world. And he would tell me, "What do you call this, inking?" And it was mildly insulting, but at the same time, it kicked my butt enough to really up my game and keep going. And every time I would visit with him, he would be very supportive, and he'd go, "Oh, you finally figured out how to do that or that." And it was just like, it was this ongoing thing, and he was such a good mentor to me, and such a delightful, nice guy. And the second time I saw him, he ran up to me and goes, "Bill, how you doing?" And I never thought of him as that gregarious. He was more, you know, not shy, but reserved. But he was always like really happy to see me, like he was my uncle or something. And he was just a really sweetheart. And you know, his Flash Gordon stuff was amazing, and probably second only to Alex himself. And he just, I don't know, he never ceased to amaze me. And his Star Wars stuff was amazing. And he never lost it. Yeah. And his Daredevil stuff was great. And he made John Romita Jr. look good, you know.
I read all his Secret Agent Corrigans, and it's as amazing and as active his art was. Like every footage I see of him speaking, he's so kind of almost a little more silent and a little more, his auditory wasn't as bombastic as his art was.
Yeah, he also tended to be a little self-deprecating as well.
Yeah.
He was a huge art collector, too. He had a lot of Raymond and Foster originals, but quite a while. Great artwork collection.
This lady did all the coloring for the EC Comics, most of the coloring for the EC Comics, and she was very, very good at it. She was the first to be recognized for doing what we call subjective color, which means that instead of coloring a panel as you normally would with a blue suit and a brown hat and so on, she would sometimes color the entire panel all one color. And it was often red, and it meant that, you know, that was a moment of violence or something like that. And I think what she was really doing was just trying to cover up some of the gore that the artist put into those particular panels. But she was one of the original EC gang. She's also well known for her caricatures of the EC artists and staff over at the art table, you'll see some of her caricatures from back in the 50s, and one of the pieces that you'll be bidding on later tonight is a delightful full-color caricature of King Bill Gaines holding court with all his artists and writers. Marie Severin.
I got a job down on Wall Street, and then when John was working at EC, they were dissatisfied with the coloring of, because they did it through the, most of it through the printing house would have these separators doing it. They'd send up the artwork, and they'd make what they called silver prints, and the people would color them up, and then they give them to the, they did the whole operation in the printing press, and then they'd make the plates and send the mats up to Buffalo Press, I believe was the one that was for EC. And they were unhappy because they'd have people on the street with like green, yellow and blue suits on and stuff, and there was no care and stuff. And Harvey was very particular. He was starting the war books, and that's when I came in. I didn't do the very early ECs. It was only around the time Harvey came and started the war. Two-Fisted, I think, was his first one. And he liked the fact that I took a little more time and tried to be consistent and tried to bring things forward and back. And I learned a lot from him, too, because Harvey was like a comic book Picasso, you know. And then Bill and Al were unhappy, too, with their crime stories and horror stories. They wanted more mood, they wanted more action stuff. So, not action in the color, but a little more flair and so forth. And I did them, and then they gave the whole line to me, which was fun. Then I had to go on staff because I just didn't come up and pick up. I was working on Wall Street. I'd run up there, pick up a job, run home, color it up, bring it back. You know, you have to work and stuff. And then I went on full time. Never got out of the, yes, I did get out of the business after the code ruined us, but that's later.
She was amazing, and it's funny, her artwork for Marvel, she was their licensing artist, so she could do the most perfect Hulk, you know, in a pose, and then it would turn up on 1 million T-shirts. And she was just, she did, I don't know if you guys remember, but when Tony Stark went through his drinking phase and alcoholism phase, she did this beautiful splash page of Tony drunk as a skunk, and you could see all the people around him realizing, oh, that's Tony Stark, the billionaire, you know, inventor, and they're all just like looking like he's drunk. And she really embodied that, and it almost took on like a Jack Davis kind of quality, but it was, she was just amazing and unparalleled, and her coloring for the early Marvel was just a continuation of her EC stuff, and she brought this vibrancy, I think, and made those early issues just sing, you know?
And yeah, she was a caricaturist, right? And so she would do caricatures of people at the Marvel bullpen, but Grant, tell us, I mean, when she was doing the coloring at EC, I mean, she was also doing some things to kind of subdue the horror aspect a little. Is that correct?
Yeah.
What's the story there?
What Russ Cochran was talking about, if she thought a panel was particularly violent, she would sometimes color it all in yellow or all in blue or all in red, you know, to kind of tone it down. So in other words, she wasn't highlighting the blood on the axe or the whatever the panel was. She thought, you know, less is more. And she was an incredible colorist. And I commissioned some artwork. In fact, the kind of backdrop that you used was a piece I commissioned from Marie for my book, Foul Play. And it shows all the EC artists having lunch with Gaines and Feldstein and everybody at a place called Patrici's, this Italian restaurant that Gaines used to take all the artists to when they were delivering a job. So she was a great artist.
Yeah. And she talked about her relationship with Harvey Kurtzman, and here's a story that Ric Estrada talks about his first job at EC.
How I got to EC. I was working with Dan Barry in the same studio, in that Bible House studio with the artist I mentioned before. Dan Barry was just beginning to do his Flash Gordon comic strip. He took over the Flash Gordon comic strip. And Harvey Kurtzman was writing a script for Dan Barry for the Flash Gordon comic strip. And he came to the studio, and Dan and I had adjacent desks, well, not adjacent, facing each other, really. And I was introduced to Harvey Kurtzman. And Dan said, this is Rick, and he's an artist, and he's in comics, et cetera, et cetera. Would you like to see his work? and Harvey Kurtzman saw my work, and he said, how would you like to do a story for me? Two-Fisted Tales. And I said, gee, I'd be delighted. Because at that time, EC Comics was the big thing. I mean, they were doing the more cinematic type of continuity that nobody had quite done so far. And Harvey was writing terrific stories. And so a couple of days later, he showed up with a U.S. Army helmet. And I don't think it was a bayonet, but it was a cartridge belt and some other equipment. He said, I want you to be authentic, and here's the script. Do anything you want. Now, his script was not typewritten like most scripts. What he did, he always drew on tracing paper. He would draw every panel in his own very cartoony, very fast, very dynamic way. And then he'd write the balloon, the speech balloons on each panel. And he said, here's my stuff. You know, I did this, and I usually stage it this way, but you do anything you want. So I followed almost everything, and I changed a couple of things that I thought I could improve. And he came back, and he looked at it, and he said, you changed 2 things. And I said, well, you told me I could change anything I wanted to. And he said, well, you know, my stuff, I'd rather you didn't change anything. And that was my beginning with EC. Then that story was called Bunker. It was the first story in comics ever that featured a black soldier, a black GI. Harvey Kurtzman did a lot of firsts. That was the first he did. And he was very racially aware of these things. And it was really a story about racial inequality in the Army. And it ends very, very cleverly, because then it's this black platoon taking an enemy position, and then a white platoon says, we took it, and the blacks say, no, we took it. And then the sergeant walks over and says, this is the U.S. Army, we all took it. And that was the basic idea, that we're all equal.
So I'll chime in on this one. So, you know, a few weeks before the event, Russ Cochran called me. We're both guitar players, as you can see. And Russ has a pretty good singing voice. So he said, you know, we should play some stuff at the dinner, and why don't we write parody lyrics to a couple tunes? One was an existing standard called Seems Like Old Times. And then he suggested using the theme from the Ballad of Davy Crockett as the other one. So we got together. Well, what happened, so this was a few weeks before the event, and then, I don't know, maybe 5-6 days before the event, he called and he goes, I don't know, Grant, I don't know if this is such a good idea, you know, I think we might have to back out on this one. And I said, you know, Russ, it's going to be fine, we'll just get together, you know, in San Diego, and we'll be able to do it. And he goes, okay. So we got together in my hotel room next door here at the Marriott for a couple hours, and banged out these parody lyrics, and I think you have one of the songs that we did that night. So. We might have you sing along as we...
Yeah, that's a good idea. When we come to the chorus, feel free to sing along. Born in Brooklyn in 22, the son of Max Gaines, he's the man who invented the comic book for me and you, so all little kids will have something to do. William Gaines, across of the EC line. He hired Al Feldstein and Johnny Gray. He grabbed Bremming by his rotten old leg. All on the trend, chase the buck, trying to come up with a broken buck. William Gaines, boss of the EC line. He tried some crime books and a romance line. He did some westerns and did just fine. Adding new titles to the EC line, and all they were doing was passing time. William Gaines, boss of the EC line. Well, Al said, why should we follow the trends? Let's do something different. They did, and then Crypt of terror and the haunt of fear, the vault of horror, that's why
here.
William Gaines, boss of the EC line. Well, Bill said, why should we stop there? Let's try something else that's weird. Shock and crime and two distant tales appeared on the stands, and up went the same. William Gaines, boss of the EC line. We'll get Jack Davis for the gory stuff, and Kamen Tender all the pretty girls and fluff. Wood and Williamson and Torres too. English can draw the kooky goo. William Gaines, on the EC line. Bring great artists to the company. All of them wanted to work for EC. Elder, Severin, John, and Marie. It was so great they would work for free. William Gaines, boss of the EC line. Then came the day that the ECs fell. Keep offers, Harry blew them all to hell. Just when things were looking pretty bad, Kurtzman said, let's make a magazine of that. They did William Gaines, boss of the EC line. Well, the rest is history, as we all know. Mad Magazine continued to grow, and as for EC, well, here's the best part. Old Bill Gaines saved all of the art. William Gaines, boss of the EC line.
Greg, how is it watching that footage of you and Russ? I mean,
it's just fun. I just remember what a great night. And I also distinctly remember, Annie Gaines singing along at the top of her lungs to the chorus. And I remember Jack Kamen clapping along and smiling, and Feldstein nodding approvingly. It's like, this is really surreal. Like, what am I doing playing for all these EC guys? It was really cool.
And you know what? It summed up the entire history of EC in one song. That was just amazing.
And we just did that, in a couple hours, and Russ didn't think we could do it, but we soldiered on.
So I just want to comment on the technical side of it, because the mic that I had set up was sitting at the lectern, so it only picked up a good sound when Russ was in front of there. When you guys were singing, I was picking up ambient sound in the room, and it was all shot on high 8.
I love the fact that the whole audience applauded at the line that old Bill Gaines saved all the art. That was great.
Yeah. And by the way, Russ Cochran. I mean, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it?
Well,
he ended up selling it all at auction?
Yeah.
So we have 3 minutes for questions. Does anyone have questions?
Well, John.
What's next with all this great interview footage? Will we see it again, or
Well,
24 years.
Yeah.
Well, David and I are making some plans for something, for a bigger audience with the footage and more of the footage too, because that's like 1/5 of the footage. So,
Each one of those interviews, except Al Feldstein is about an hour, and each one of the other interviews are half-hour interviews, so you're only watching 2 or 3 minutes of each one of them, and then the dinner itself is about an hour.
Yeah, it's a lot actually.
Yeah, so there's probably 7 or 8 hours worth of footage. So yes, we're talking about how do we put that together in a feasible way so that people can watch it and not go crazy, and then price it so that actually it makes sense.
And I just want to say, David's mentioned to me for years that he had this footage. Yeah, I have it. It's in storage. It's on video. I should do something with that, And And I finally said, a couple of years ago we had lunch, it's like, man, you got to get those out of storage and get that digitized, and that's where Alex came in. So,
It was a lot of fun going through that. And there's also the DC and other Marvel interviews too. He has a lot, and remastering and editing that stuff and going through, it's like I felt like I virtually got to know all those people that are mostly gone. And after that, and I would kind of get a sense of their cadence and speech, I kind of mourned at the end of each one. It was very surreal, but I loved it. And thanks for David for giving me that chance.
And I hadn't seen them. I mean, I had transferred a lot of the stuff to VHS, but I haven't had a VHS player in years. I haven't looked at most of this stuff in 20 years. Yeah. I am surprised at how good the interviews are and how well it reveals the character of the people that I interviewed, because they all had a sense of fun. Comic books and comic book artists, they look at it as a business, of course, but they also look at it as fun as we do as collectors. And it's great to see them talk, getting excited about talking about the things that they do.